Good morning, everyone. My name is Shana Gross. I'm an associate ecologist for the Central Sierra Province with the Forest Service in Region 5. In this talk, I will focus on two products that were key for landscape management planning in the Lake Tahoe West, the Landscape Resilience Assessment and the Landscape Restoration Strategy. Before I continue, I want to highlight that this has been a very collaborative process. The Landscape Resilience Assessment had 14 co-authors and was also reviewed by a number of stakeholders, while the restoration strategy had 76 people who contributed from 7 different teams. I'm sure there'll be additional information provided on Lake Tahoe West as we move through this symposium. However, since this is one of the first talks, I wanted to highlight a couple of things. Lake Tahoe West is on the west shore of Lake Tahoe in California, and Pat gave a really great overview of why Tahoe is so special. The goal of Lake Tahoe West is to increase the resilience of the forest watersheds and recreational opportunities and communities on Lake Tahoe's west shore, while planning for a dynamic and changing future. In order to do this, a multi-agency collaborative effort was initiated to scale up and accelerate restoration efforts. The goal of this multi-agency effort was to address the entire landscape and evaluate the landscape regardless of ownership. These are the steps that the Lake Tahoe West has taken to complete these key planning documents. It has been an iterative process with manager and stakeholder and scientist input. In this talk, I will walk through examples of how we defined resilience, how we identified values, services, and disturbances, how we selected indicators, how we identified what the desired conditions for those indicators would be, and then how we collected data and analyzed that data to evaluate current condition, and finally how we translated that into a strategy. Lake Tahoe West was established to really focus on resilience rather than desired condition. While there are many definitions of resilience, this was actually one step that did not involve a lot of collaborative process. A definition was presented to the various teams and adopted without much discussion. Perhaps this could have used more discussion, but it worked for Lake Tahoe West. The definition was key because it helped frame the entire process of what we were trying to achieve. And the definition that we used is presented on this slide, and it's from Walker et al. 2004. One of the first steps Lake Tahoe West took was to identify what values and services we wanted to be resilient, and what then we wanted, and which disturbances we wanted those values and services to be resilient to. This resulted in 8 landscape values and services and 8 disturbance types. For the disturbance types that are presented on the slide, they're presented in sort of a hierarchy of inclusion. So for example, air pollution does not include air pollution related to fire. Or the climate change disturbance type is climate change that is not related to the fire, flood, drought, or insects and disease categories that are identified above. I just want to highlight that identifying these different values and services and disturbances was a very collaborative step, and it involved multiple iterations to make sure that resilience was captured from all the different stakeholder perspectives. After we identified the values and services and the disturbance types, we developed a matrix where the values and services were essentially on an x-axis and the disturbance types were on the y-axis in this table. And from this matrix, we populated each box with indicators. In this example that's presented here, you can see there are 10 indicators we thought we could use to evaluate upland forest ecosystems' resilience to fire. When we added indicators, we considered indicators that would be meaningful, but also indicators where there was data available to evaluate both the desired resilience and the current resilience. In some cases, we identified indicators that we felt were important, but that data did not exist for. So in this example, we considered wildlife connectivity as important, but we didn't quite have enough resources and data sets to fully evaluate that. So we identified this as an indicator that we would want to evaluate in the future. The landscape resilience assessment ended up evaluating a total of 21 indicators where there was some level of current condition data and the ability to evaluate what the current condition meant relative to resilience. In addition to the individual indicators, we also rolled the indicators up into what we considered a composite indicator, where we kind of averaged the resilience of each of the individual indicators. In this example on the screen, we identified all the indicators available that we could combine to identify resilience to fire. In this example, you will notice some of the indicators under the forest did not transfer to the composite. One example of this was cereal stage, and that's because a specific spot on the ground could not be identified as resilient or not. Rather, the entire landscape was identified for a range of resilient cereal stage proportions. You'll also notice that there's some indicators in this composite resilience to fire that are not in the landscape value upland forest ecosystem, and that's because there's a number of other rows in this matrix that aren't presented in this talk. Once we identified the indicators, we identified the current or the desired, we called it resilient condition. And we used published literature values from historic data as well as reference stand data. We also used best professional judgment when historic or reference data was unavailable. In this example, we identified 3 categories for resilience of trees per acre by vegetation type. This data was derived primarily from the literature. In general, as forests become more dense, they are less resilient to disturbance, and that's what's reflected in these resilience categories based on the literature we found for the natural range of variability. A resilience category for trees per acre was the mean of the reference data. Our less resilient category is the upper range of the reference data, and our least resilience was outside of the reference data that we used. After identifying the indicators and range of resilience, we evaluated available data to determine if we could identify current condition. All 21 indicators that were evaluated in the LRA were evaluated based on spatial data. LIDAR data was aggregated into similar ecological units based on stand and tree level metrics from the LIDAR in a product that is called ECObject that the Forest Service Remote Sensing Lab developed. You can see from the images that the above image is of where the tree approximate objects are from the LIDAR data set, while the lower image shows how the landscape was aggregated by the blue polygon lines. 4 of the 21 indicators we evaluated were based on the LIDAR data compiled by ECObject, while other spatial data sources were tied and synthesized to the ECObject data. For each ECObject polygon, resilience was then evaluated for each of the 21 indicators and then averaged for the composite indicators. After we compiled all the data based on the comparison of the current condition to the desired resilient condition, we evaluated the landscape conditions. In this figure, the percent area is displayed with the color bars on the bottom and the x-axis. A value of 1 indicates resilience, while a value of 1 indicates least resilience, while a value of 0 represents resilient. The proportion of the Lake Tahoe West landscape assessed for each indicator is displayed on the upper axis and is outlined in black bars because for some indicators, there wasn't data available for all of the landscape. And so in the example I'm walking through for trees per acre, there was about 42,000 acres that were evaluated because there's a lot of area that is just rock outcrops or non-forested areas. For trees per acre, we identified 24% of the landscape as resilient, 49% as less resilient, and 27% as least resilient. So in addition to these general summaries of the total landscape resilience, we also evaluated the resilience spatially to determine which portions of the landscape are least resilient. In this figure, the blue is resilient, yellow is less resilient, and red is least resilient. For trees per acre, resilient areas are located at higher elevations and in the wilderness, whereas least resilient areas are in canyons and intermixed with less resilient areas. And these trends we could pick out by looking at the data spatially. So what does trees per acre mean for resilience to fire? When we think about the composite indicator, this composite indicator is a composite of 9 different indicators used to evaluate landscape resilience to fire, and those indicators were averaged. We had a lot of discussion about if we should average or weight based on the quality of the data or the importance, but in the end, it was easiest just to simply average. In this figure, most resilient is the blue and less resilient is the red. So for resilience to fire, 51% of the landscape is less resilient, with only 1% of the landscape having high resilience. We also looked at the composite indicator spatially. In this figure, resilience to fire, blue are areas of high resilience and red are areas of low resilience. There's resilience to fire in canyons and at lower elevations around the shore of Lake Tahoe. So our next step after we evaluated the current condition through the landscape assessment was to begin to think about how current condition would inform management on the landscape. The assessment combined with multiple science approaches, some of which you will hear about after this talk, provided the foundation for the development of the science-based landscape restoration strategy. The strategy guides watershed and forest restoration approaches on the West Shore over the next 2 decades to increase social ecological resilience. The strategy itself has 6 goals and 27 objectives. In this talk, I'm going to present some information on how trees per acre current condition combined with science work translated to management. One of the specific objectives of the strategy is to decrease tree density on 40,000 acres in order to achieve the goal of forests to recover from fire, drought, and insect and disease outbreaks. This 40,000 acres was identified based on the landscape assessment. The table presented here shows acres of less and least resilient trees per acre by management zone, and you can see that the total of that is 40,000 acres. This was then evaluated to identify how many of these acres would be treated by thinning versus how many of these acres could only be treated using fire. And in order to try to push our current management, we considered slopes that were greater than 70% as having no opportunity for anything but prescribed fire or managed wildfire. This objective to complete upland thinning treatments to increase snowpack retention was specifically informed by Lake Tahoe West science, specifically the water quantity modeling. This objective helps to inform where the 40,000 acres of thinning might be the first priority. This objective can be implemented by removal of understory conifers up to 20 meters tall and relatively dense stands, particularly at lower elevations. This is explained in a detailed strategy matrix in the strategy of how to prioritize and implement the work that's being proposed with the objectives and goals. The objective in the strategy This objective in the strategy is that within the WUI, which is a wildland-urban interface zone, 5,000 acres of the initial entry fuels treatments occur within the first 5 years. And if you go back to the current condition, it identifies 13,000 acres in the WUI defense that are less or least resilient. 8,000 of those acres of work has occurred or is currently planned since the current condition evaluation, because the current condition evaluation for the trees per acre is based on 2010 data, thereby leaving 5,000 acres of priority work. This objective was supported by the science work, which showed that scenarios that involve more intense levels of treatment reduce the amount of high severity fire in the wildland-urban interface and the risk of wildfire to residential properties. The assessment and strategy were foundational products for Lake Tahoe West that support landscape level planning. They reflect an extraordinary amount of collaboration and consensus building among agencies, scientists, and stakeholders. And with that, I just wanted to leave you with the links of where both the landscape resilience assessment and landscape restoration strategy live, but you can also simply search Lake Tahoe West landscape resilience assessment and strategy. And so with that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I will exit out of this and the next person can talk.